Hey everyone, this is Hanney Seylim, Critical Faculty, and today I'd like to welcome back for the third time now, the magnificent Dan. How are you, Dan?
Good morning or good evening, whatever time it is for you there in Australia. It's 8 o'clock.
Morning.
It's 8 o'clock. Oh, it is morning. Okay.
1 in the morning, though.
Well, for me, it's 8 in the morning the day before. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, time is relative.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, you and I are relative too. We have a common ancestor somewhere back in history, I'm sure.
It would be. I always found fascinating your ancestors from the obviously the original dwellers of the Americas, and I always found that quite fascinating.
Yeah, we want to make America great again, the way it used to be.
Well, congratulations. I have to congratulate you on finally getting rid of nonsense and hopefully heading towards some sort of sanity in the next few years.
Well, it'd be a lot better than before. Of course, our group is not, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is not political, but we can comment on religion in government and politics. And Biden, of course, is very religious. Biden goes to church. He even prayed and he even talks about God. So we're complaining about that. But obviously, when it comes to policy, his policies are going to be much more friendly to state-church separation and to non-believers.
Yeah, I agree. It sounds like to have the next atheist American president, it's going to be a big ask. And probably for now, you guys are going to have to be content with mild ones who can play ball with the rest of the population.
Well, if it happens in 20 years, I'll be in my 90s, so I don't think I can run. So.
Do you think Bernie? I mean, there's talks about Bernie Sanders. Obviously, he's a Jew, and as Christopher Hitchens once said, all Jews have a gene for atheism. Do you think he might be very secular in disguise, or what do you think?
Well, in the United States, most Jews that I know are very, very secular, except for the extreme Orthodox. But there's a joke here that in America, what do you call a Jew who doesn't believe in God?
A Jew who doesn't believe in God. Well, a Jew.
A Jew. There you go.
It is. And that is going to be a very nice segue to the conversation, because that's ontology in a way, which is basically the meaning of the word lies within the word itself. And today I wanted to have a conversation with you about the teleological argument for God, because when I was trying to chat to you off stream and telling you about the current trend in the Middle East and the Muslim and the Arabic world, they're trying to follow suit of the new trend of it's not enough to talk about angels, clouds, and fluffy stuff. Nowadays, people are people of science, whether we like it or not. You use your phone, your computer. It is the most convincing argument. And therefore, they want to invoke teleology. You're using things. Things are there to be used for something. They couldn't be just a fluke. And therefore, intelligent design, fine-tuning, and arguments like that have become very, very popular in the Muslim world. However, when I track down, which seems to be very interesting, seems to our understanding or our proof of God seems to flow from our knowledge of the world. So you'll find the ontological argument quite strong in the very beginning. The Anselm ontological argument, the things the way they are, because we were still examining things the way they are. And then we moved to epistemology, and we wanted to know why things the way they are, and what is the source of that information. Is it the mind or is it the experience? And then you end up with the Thomas Aquinas four cosmological argument, and there was a fifth that was not looked at for quite some time, which is the teleological argument, and then looked up by William Paley, the watchmaker. So we seem to be tracking God in the way we know best. As we improve in our knowledge and understanding of the world around us, we're changing the way we want to track God. And right now, it is teleology and things must be designed, fine-tuning, intelligent design. What do you think of that, Dan?
Well, I think you're right. And those kind of fall within what you might call natural theology as opposed to revealed theology. I don't know very many believers, Christians or Muslims or Jews, who originally came to their faith in God as a result of contemplating the ontological argument or the teleological argument. I mean, maybe there were a few, maybe, but most people come to their faith first. And then when they're pressed about it, they have to back up and say, well, how do I defend this? So then it's called apologetics. You're defending your faith. And then they come up with these other arguments to say, well, yeah, my faith makes sense because there's all these scientific reasons. So I suppose there's a handful of people who would say they were like William Paley. They were walking across the field and their foot hit something and they look down and there's this watch on the ground and they pick it up and what is this? This isn't a rock. This isn't a plant. This is something that looks like it was designed and constructed with a purpose. And look at how it's moving. This obviously didn't just grow out of the ground, right? It was constructed. So the design argument is sort of a catch-all umbrella way to describe a lot of these teleological, is the word you used, which I do a lot of debates. And I think rhetorically, the design argument is probably the easiest to talk about. Some of the others are hard to talk about. The first debate I did with a Muslim, Hassanain Rajabali in Queens, the first debate I did with a Muslim was, he pretty much brought up ontological arguments. Existence exists, we exist, existence is contingent, existence requires a context beyond which it can make. And so he was talking about those kind of things. He didn't bring up teleology, but other Muslim debaters I've talked with they brought up teleology as well. So it's fascinating. It's a good mind exercise, but of course it depends on the strength of the argument itself. It depends on how valid that is, whether or not you can go from nothing basically and using your brain to go from that into, oh, there's a God. That's kind of what the point is of all these arguments.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. Immanuel Kant once said there will never be a Newton for a blade of grass, and boy, was he wrong. Because we had Dawkins, Charles Darwin, yeah, whose day is on the 12th of February, not too far away. And he was wrong. Maybe there will be one day a Newton for cosmology, where the apparent design is completely explained quite nicely and simply.
So there's a difference between cosmological arguments and teleological arguments. Cosmological are looking back to a cause. What was the first cause, the prime mover, what caused the Big Bang, that kind of thing. Teleological arguments are looking the other way. They're looking to the end. What was the point of this thing being made? What was it designed for? What was its purpose? So and so they lump together, I think, amongst people who sit in the church pews. They're thinking kind of about the same thing. Well, who made it all, and why did he make it? Why are we here? How did that watch get here? So I remember I was reading Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, maybe 30 years ago. How old is that book now? 25 years ago. And there was one little sentence in the middle of a paragraph that was almost like a throwaway sentence, but it just hit me between the eyes, bang, where he was talking about things like the watch. You say, well, the watch was designed. Obviously, we know that, don't we? Have you ever seen a watch that wasn't designed? And it's complex and it's functioning. So there's this functional complexity. And then right in the middle of that paragraph, Dawkins says, of course, anything that can design something that's complex like a watch has to be at least as complex as the watch itself in order to design it. So bang, if complexity requires a designer, and if the designer is complex, then the designer requires a designer. So you get into this infinite regress. You get into this like, well, and then so there are some theologians who try to say, well, God is not complex. God is simple. God is ultimate simplicity. They try to get around that. But it's a good argument. Look at a watch. A watch wasn't just designed in one step. A watch has an evolutionary history of its own. through many earlier attempts, from sundials to sand clocks to timepieces to pendulums to whatever, until the pocket watch. And it was not designed by one person. It was through trial and error, through mistakes, probably a company, probably a team of experts. So if you're going to use the watch analogy as an evidence of design, then the universe was designed by an experimenting team of experts over time who tried this until they finally got it right. And watches aren't perfect. Watches break down, So the analogy, really teleological arguments are mostly arguments by analogy. Here's how humans do things. So look at this over here. Look at this plant. So humans do things this way. Therefore, this plant was done that way too. So we're using this analogical argument to try to apply what we know about human design to what we don't know about nature.
Yes, we do it all the time. We use analogies to get sort of an idea a bit closer to somebody else's mind. But, there is a very famous logical fallacy, special pleading. And God seems to be the embodiment of this particular fallacious argument, because whenever you build a case and you start to apply it to that God, they go, hold on, he is exempt from that. You can't apply that to him. And it's always been a problem. And I agree with the design situation here, because I think, remember as well, Christopher Hitchens once said, what kind of God, will create the plumbing very close to the recreational area? It seems to be designed by a committee.
Yeah, by whatever happens to work. So the phrase that I use most of the time is called begging the question, or which is another way of saying circular reasoning. It's the argument is that everything except God needs a designer, therefore there's a God. So what you've done is you've brought your conclusion into your premise.
Yes.
You're starting with a premise and you're excluding your conclusion. And so you've already concluded it before you even start arguing. That's called circular reasoning. So if God doesn't need, if God is a complex functioning being who doesn't need to be designed, then you can't use that in an argument for God, because you've already assumed the God in the first place.
Yeah. I was listening to Bart Ehrman a couple of days ago, and he brought up something that made me think and ponder, because we are told that God was the first entity, and everything else existed upon his demand or upon his command. But for some reason, in the Bible, when you read the very first verses of the Bible in Genesis, it seems that God's spirit was flying or floating over water. And Bart Ehrman was talking about the water pre-existed God, or was there as almost as ancient as God. And the firmament is nothing but the space between the two waters. That's why when Noah's flood, he wasn't really flooding. He was bringing earth to its original condition, which is water. And that firmament was the area in between the two waters. Does that mean water is as eternal as God, and he did not create it?
Well, it kind of seems right. I know in my Native American tribe, the Delaware tribe of Indians, we have a creation myth. All the tribes, all the groups in the world have their creation myths, the Hindus and different ones. And in one version of our myth, because they changed over time, but in one version of it, this turtle was swimming in the water, and that's all there was the water and a turtle. But then the turtle went down beneath the water and found some mud and brought the mud up, and then that mud dried and became the continents. And then it spread and it grew, and then the tree grew on the continent, and then a rabbit came by and it saw this blood clot on the ground, and so all of that kind of presupposes a pre-existence of something, but a lot of them have to do with water. And that's not so far off from science, is it? I mean, the evolution of life on the planet started in the water. So water is a big deal. And so was it here all the time, or was God? And I think a corollary question to that is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It starts off with, in the beginning, God. But as you point out, did God have to be the first? Could God have been the end result of a process? And Richard Dawkins even says, okay, from everything we know about science and living things, if there is a God, then that God can only be explained through evolution itself. That God had to evolve as well. Otherwise, it's just poof, you know. Of course, when I was a preacher, I would have said, well, God is eternally existent, and he was just always there. He didn't need a creator, which conveniently exempts him from any of the arguments. It makes it a circular argument, right?
Yeah, it's really funny, and you know, in the Quran, there is that verse that talks about if Allah wanted something to be, He would just need to utter the word "be," and then it's be, and it's very, very replicated in the Genesis, and you know, let there be light. God has to speak His will for that will to manifest. But I've got an issue here. You've got the Kalam cosmological argument where Lane Craig is always talking about this God has to be personal and exist outside of time and space. God is not subject to time. However, how can you be not subject to time and your actions require sequential movements and uttering? So obviously these primitive people did not perceive of something more powerful than saying something to be and then it's there. You can imagine a God that actually, as he thinks about something, it emerges spontaneously at the same time without uttering a word. But that uttering of the word must precede must be before the actual thing happening, and therefore that requires time. How can he be out of time then?
Yeah, even outside of time, if you can imagine a being functioning outside of time, we can't, because to be a being is to, you know, to function within time. If there's this God and he has thoughts, obviously one of the thoughts preceded another thought, either in time or out of time. Instead of saying before, we could say antecedents. In the mind of God, there would be these antecedent thoughts. Did God one day create a universe, and then he looked around and said, oh, look, I created a universe. Now I'm going to decide to create the universe. I mean, what came first, the deciding or the creating? So even outside of time, you still have that logical antecedent. And if William Lane Craig is right, his mathematical argument, which the Kalam argument uses, if he's right, that there cannot be an infinite series of preceding events, right? There had to be a first.
Yes.
Because if there was an infinite number before right now, we never would have got to now. But we did get to now, so there must not have been an infinite number. If that argument is true, it's also true in the mind of God. True. God, if there's an infinite number of antecedent events in the mind of God, he could never have got to this point to say, let there be light. So there must have been a first event. There must have been a beginning to God, if you use that same logic. But I thought we were going to talk about teleology. But
it was just the beginning, the introduction to the conversation. So back to teleology, and we talked about that watch, and I think you and I, the analogy is completely flawed. Finding a watch is completely different than organism that you can understand the mechanism of its own, of its evolution. So I thought it was a horrible analogy anyway, and I think Richard Dawkins did a very good job with the blind watchmaker. He still said that there is some sort of illusion of a design. Looks like from the outside, it looks designed, but that watchmaker, being nature or natural selection, is completely blind. It does not have a purpose at the end.
Well, there's a difference between design and intelligent design. So yes, there is. It's not even an illusion of design. There is design in nature, but is it intelligent? When you look at a snowflake and you see, oh, look at that beautiful arrangement, and it's, wow, how symmetric and intricate, and most snowflakes are different from each other. Did some designer come up and with his fingers put each of those little molecules in place to design this thing? Or can we explain that snowflake in purely natural terms according to the laws of nature? The way that H2O molecules combine and put together, especially when they're frozen, you know, and if you can explain that without intelligence, well, then you do have design by nature, and then you can have design by evolution, you know, by natural selection. So there's a lot of things. When you look at a sand dune, for example, and not only that nice creased ridge along the top, but all these nice ripples that are nice and in order, right? You say, wow, did somebody's finger come along and just neatly did some intelligent designer put all those things there to make that beauty? Or I was walking by the lake shore a couple years ago up in Lake Michigan, and I noticed the gently lapping waves coming in. And if you look out toward the water, there's these stones and rocks out in the water. But as you get closer to the shore, they get smaller and they get smaller. And pretty soon that's sand, kind of coarse sand. And up higher, it's finer sand. And way up at the top is very powdery kind of sand. And you notice that distribution of the rocks and the sand along there, and it's stretching on for miles. And I was thinking, well, how did that happen? Did somebody come along and manually sort? The little light ones all go up here, and the little. You don't need that. You don't need intelligence to explain this illusion or this appearance of design. You can just do it by gravity and the weight of the rocks. The smaller particles are going to be carried further by the waves, and they're going to be deposited further up. And the heavier ones aren't going to move as far. So just by invoking some laws of nature, gravity basically, and friction and forces of the waves, you can account for that appearance of design without an intelligent designer.
Yeah, and I was sort of shocked listening to a story about Francis Collins. So this is a gentleman, you know him very well,
Yeah.
or of him.
Brilliant.
He's obviously he's rejecting intelligent design. He's very pro-evolution. Guy is very smart, very intelligent, very responsible, very respectable, very good man, actually. Apparently, he was helping Christopher Hitchens in his final days with helping with his genome and see if they can create a treatment that targets the cancer, particularly for Christopher Hitchens. I became friends with Christopher Hitchens. But this very gentleman who rejected the very illusion of design falls to his knees at a waterfall frozen into 3 parts and accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. What kind of partition in the human brain to allow for that?
Yeah, well, our brains have so many modules and partitions. I guess that's a good word. Like I'm a professional musician, so I can listen to the world through the framework of the structure of music, or I can just appreciate the aesthetics of the music apart from the actual logical. You can do both things at once. So it doesn't mean I'm 2 different people. And William Lane Craig even says, most of the time when he makes his arguments, often he ends with his personal experience that God appeared to him and he knows him. And some of the other opponents I debated say the same thing. Hernandez, what was his first name? He said, well, you can't tell me that my brother doesn't exist. I know my brother. I've met my brother, and he's very real to me. And you can argue all you want. My brother does exist because I have met him. So a lot of believers like Collins and others will say, well, I know God. I've met him. I've felt him. He's within me. And it's something I can't share with you because you're going to have to experience it yourself. And so fine. I would never deny, you would never deny that these people had a very powerful inner experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to like in the middle of the night, I have a nightmare and I wake up and I sit up in bed and I scream and I wake everybody up in the house and my heart is pounding and my palms are sweating and I'm scared. You can't deny that I had a very powerful experience, very real human experience. But there's no boogeyman crawling through the window. Not really. It's in the brain. It's happening in your mind. And I think that's true with religious experience. I think William Lane Craig and Francis Collins and C.S. Lewis and all these others had a very real, very powerful experience within their minds that was life-changing, that was motivating. But it doesn't mean there's really a boogeyman crawling through the window. It doesn't mean there really is a God. It's something that's happening in the brain.
No, completely agree on this. We go back to the creating something in order for it to be used, and that's teleology. That's the you create a mug with a handle, and you say, well, I'm creating this for it to hold the hot liquids. You probably have one in front of you there. Yeah, hot liquid, keeping the liquid sort of nice and warm, but at the same time not burning your hands. So it's designed with a function, and you try to do that as perfect as you can. We claim, or God's claimed to be the greatest of all designers, the one with perfection. But we cannot really ignore the amount of flaws in a lot of designs.
Hey,
we can have a couple.
Now, I'm going to ask you if you think this is coincidence or if this is divine providence. I just noticed that this mug was made in Australia.
Oh wow!
It
Oh, I
says
can
good.
see- I
See,
can
it
see the
says good day.
original.
Good day.
Yeah.
I didn't plan that
Wow.
before the show. So how do you explain it? Here you are in Australia, and here I am with an Australia. There has to be some purpose behind that, doesn't there?
Yeah.
You think?
Yeah. Well,
So
I don't think so, but we can still like it and say that's nice. We can still enjoy that and not refer to any supernatural realm, you know.
So thinking about a mug, which we know is designed because look at the human hand. Julia Sweeney, I don't know if she's the first to say this, but Julia Sweeney in her movie says, look at the human nose. Look at how perfectly shaped the human nose is to hold up a pair of glasses. Look at that. How do you explain that? How do you explain how perfectly the nose is made to hold up the pair of glasses? It had to be some kind of intelligent design of our nose. Or it's kind of like the guy who says, look at all these rivers that were made to flow right along the state border. Look at that. If you look at the map, you can see a lot of these rivers flow right along the border. How did they do that? It must have been a massive, engineering project. It must have cost billions of dollars to divert the river so that it would flow right along that border. Boy, that's incredible. That needs an explanation, doesn't it? Well, of course, we can all see that that's backward thinking. We're working backward from the object. The state border wasn't there first. There was no such thing. We drew our borders along the river. And I think evolution is like that too. We get to the end of it and we say, look at the human being and the human eye. How do you explain how it all fits with the environment that we live in? So these teleological arguments are really kind of backward type of arguments that we're trying to find an explanation for.
Yeah, because you know that one of the biggest one is the fine tuning, and the fine tuning is according to the likes of Sean Carroll. Even Hitchens talked about it one day. Remember that conversation, that wonderful conversation between the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and when they were asked what is the strongest argument the faithful has got going, and it was unanimous that the fine tuning is strong. Because it plays, according to Sean Carroll, plays by the rules. It seems to be an apparent design. There seems to be a certain very, very narrow gauge of which life can only be existing, and it's within that range. But as you said, it's backwards. We can only exist in the world that we can exist in. It would be miraculous if we can exist in a world we can't exist in.
Well, I've heard people say, Christians say that. Look at the seasons of the year, from winter to spring to summer to fall, and then look at the plant life. Look at the trees. The trees always lose their leaves, at a certain time, and look at how the seasons were made to match up. I mean, it would do no good to have the trees growing their leaves in the middle of winter. That wouldn't work. So it's got to be a design of God that made all the seasons fit with the way the trees grow. Of course, it's backwards. By natural selection, it was only the trees that could survive during this process of seasons. Antony Flew, the British philosopher, was impressed enough by fine tuning that he backed off a bit on his atheism. He didn't become a theist.
Yeah.
He became maybe more like a deist. But of course, the Christians took the Antony Flew's admission that the fine tuning was a power, and they said he now believes in God. Well, he didn't. That was changed. That was a swap. But I have a good way to explain this. Maybe you can tell me if it works. And Sean Carroll is right, and we've met Sean Carroll a few times. So he's one of the most brilliant expositors of science. Yeah. I think. Read his books. Suppose you were convicted of a crime and you're going to be executed by a firing squad. So they put a blindfold over your face and they lead you out and they tie you to this post and you're standing there and you're going to be executed by fire. And they tell you that there are 100 expert riflemen or rifle women, rifle persons, who are going to be doing the execution that day, and none of them have ever missed, and all their rifles are in fine working order. So you're standing there and you hear, ready, aim, fire, and then you hear this loud noise of all these 100 rifles, but you're still alive. What are the odds? It's kind of like the fine-tuning argument. There's so many variables that had to happen. What are the odds? And you're standing there, and then, so do you say, oh, well, it was just luck? Do you say that? Or do you think, wait a minute, there's got to be some explanation, doesn't there? I mean, you would think so. Like, well, yeah. What would you imagine happened? Do you think all the rifles malfunctioned at once? That's possible, but not very likely. Do you think on the one day, the very first time, all 100 shooters, they all missed it once? Do you think that's possible? That's possible, isn't it?
You know what I'm thinking? My first, I'm getting that sort of image of me closing my eyes before the execution, and they're all firing up in the air, and my executioner said, "Look, I was only screwing with you."
Yeah, well, so that's a possible explanation of being screwed with, or maybe those 100 rifle shooters, maybe they all really like you and took pity on you, and they decided that they weren't going to kill you. I mean, that's possible. And that's kind of the theistic argument, isn't it? That's like, there is this design that wants me to stay alive. And so that's why the fine tuning of everything, and so you run all these scenarios in your mind. What is it that you can't just say, well, I was lucky. You're trying to think, and Sean Carroll is right. Yeah, like playing by the rules, we got to come up with something. Well, then you take off your blindfold and you discover that there were 101 prisoners being executed that day.
Uh-huh. So the odds are distributed. Yeah.
Well, but so mathematically, yeah, at least one of you had to survive.
Yes.
Right. Is that a miracle? It's just that, yeah, there's 100 riflemen, but there's 101 prisoners. Therefore, it might not have been you. There would have been one of the 101 who would have survived, standing there going, wow, I was lucky. Or what? What's the explanation? So what you have here is a numerator-denominator thing. What are the odds, right? The odds could be like, I don't know, what do they say? 10 million to the 40th power against our universe existing. But what if there's that same number squared of possible universes?
Yes.
What if there's that many prisoners, right? What if how do you know there aren't? And of course, those of us who think, and many people do think the possibility of a multiverse, we are often accused of saying, well, you're just inventing that to get around the odds, right? You're just inventing multiverse. Well, if that's true, how do you explain the fact that there's at least one universe? What is the principle that limits it to one? You have to come up with a principle that says there has to be more than, there can only be one. Of course, these days the word universe means since the Big Bang. And now we use the word cosmos to talk about the possible larger existence where there could be more than one. And if there's more than one universe, what principle would limit it to any number, right? I mean, what would the number be? So you and I might think this denominator is this huge number and the odds of us existing is so impossible, but that's just our little brains trying to come up with the struggle with big numbers, right? It's because you could think of that same number, whatever it is, and square it or raise it to its own power, okay? I mean, there's a number. I mean, we can't even think about that. And in that case, and that's what's been happening through the history of science, we now know there's more than one planet. We now know there's more than one solar system. We now know there's more than one galaxy.
Yeah.
We now, I mean, there's all sorts of ways that our brains, and we're trying to wrap our brains around that. So, so there's one way to kind of approach the so-called fine-tuning argument. Carol is right. It needs an explanation, but let's be open to all possible explanations.
Indeed, and Neil deGrasse Tyson had a similar analogy as well about tossing the coins. You have 100 people, and he asked them to toss the coin, head or tail. If you choose head, you sit down, and then all people having the tail, they'll they'll stand up or sit down, or the opposites, and then they keep removing those who would choose tail, for example, and you'll end up eventually with that one tail guy who's still standing up, and you go, what are the odds of that? But because it's happening over a period of time, it's impossible for one person to have one tail and out of 99 head, but it's only made possible because of the amount of processes, and it's been posited before. We don't know how many failed universe experiences were before this one.
So or how many universes in the cosmos are dead. I mean, they're there, but they don't support life. They don't have the exact fine tuning to allow for that. We don't know how many there are, but if the number is infinite, then there has to be some like ours. In fact, if the number is infinite, you and I have had this conversation before. Because if you think about it, any possible configuration has happened. But that is speculation, obviously, and it's not proof. But it does show that we should not be too quick to jump to conclusions that there are no answers to some of these questions.
Yeah, we obviously, and that's the thing. Is it again probably a case of God of the gaps? Every time there is a little bit space of lack of knowledge because of something being new, like abiogenesis, always abiogenesis is conflated with evolution in the Muslim world and some of the Christian circles as well. You talk about evolution, and then suddenly somebody butts in and they explain the first cell, and he's like, that's a different science. That's called abiogenesis, and it's new, and we still don't have an answer. And they go, aha, you don't have an answer, therefore.
Well, of course you can do that. I mean, if you really don't have an answer, then you can keep all hypotheses on the table. That doesn't mean you will weight them equally. That doesn't mean you will say all hypotheses are equal. Some might be more likely than others, but still, they do have a point. You can hypothesize that the entire universe is actually the dream of a polka dotted pig. That's a hypothesis. It could be true. I wouldn't bet on it, and neither would you, but you can't actually rule that out. That's one hypothesis that you could say, well, you invented that, Dan. Well, yeah, I invented it, but still, it's on the table somewhere in the list. I would put it way down at the bottom. But there's millions and millions of possible hypotheses that we could add to that list. So in a sense, the idea of a God is a hypothesis that we can leave on the table. We should put it there. We should not just shut them out. We should say, okay, there it is. Just like all others, you have the same responsibility to provide evidence or proof or good reasoning for your hypotheses as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, fair enough. Let's entertain it then for a bit then. Let's say, okay, well, how about we'll go with there seems to be a creator who's perfect and who's loving and is full of love and goodness and perfection and willed existence to be. And therefore, you'd expect that existence to be perfect and his creation to be at least the creation to be perfect. Obviously, the Christians will have a different story. Say, look, we're fallen, so we're trying to get back to that perfection that we once had. But what about the anatomy? I mean, you examine the human eye, you examine bits and pieces, the organs that we no longer need. Wisdom teeth, bladder. A lot of things seems to be we can do away with. And it seems to be that evolution is refining things as it goes blindly. But it doesn't seem to be an intelligent or perfect creation out there. Why is this not entertained? When they look at that, they go, oh, the reason for this is God is testing us, or creating with you with some imperfections will entice you to work and struggle hard, or that's part of your punishment as a fallen ones. Well, how do you explain that?
Well, it's because they're starting with God. They have an a priori requirement, definition, that God does exist, and then everything flows from that. So that's a kind of a circular reasoning. I debated, who was it? The guy in Canada a few weeks ago. Really nice guy. I forgot his name. And he basically said, in order to understand the Bible, you need to start with the idea that God is perfect. And then when you do that, when you read the Bible, you will see how to explain all these things. And I jumped in and said, well, wait a minute, you are denying the possibility that there might be mistakes in the Bible, because in advance you're already saying that God is perfect. So a perfect God is a hypothesis. Yeah, it's a hypothesis, and we can leave it on the table. But it's not the only one. There might be an imperfect God.
Mm-hmm.
There might be an evil God who is playing with us. I mean, that's also on the table. And if you read the Bible, it looks pretty much like it is an evil God who's, running things. Although there are a couple of verses that say God is love. Actions speak louder than words, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And natural selection was a hypothetical part of Darwin's theory, and which needed to be tested. It needed to be proved. It needed to be fleshed out. So a lot of these hypotheses might or might not be wrong, but let's look at them through reasoning. Let's look at them through logic, and let's take all the a priori off the table. Let's take all of that off, that God has to be perfect or that God has to be good, and then reason from there.
Right. I mean, one of the accusations we all face, I'm not sure where in the scale are you in atheism, but I've always keep the door open to be convinced if there are good evidence. But we're always often accused of we choose not to believe in God. We say there is no God. We're positive, and we're sure there is no God, and that's what we claim. But every time I speak to an atheist, especially the sophisticated ones, they would always talk about, even Richard Dawkins himself is never talked. I think he's got a scale of 7, and he's 6 point something out of 7.
Yeah.
He's left the door open still to be convinced.
Well, we all do that with everything. Leprechauns in Ireland might exist. I don't think you believe in leprechauns. I don't believe in leprechauns. There's a difference between saying I don't believe in them and between saying I do believe they've been disproved. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think leprechauns have been disproved. So to be intellectually honest, I have to allow for the possibility, 6.999, that there really are leprechauns, that we haven't seen them yet. But look there's stories about leprechauns. There's songs about leprechauns. There's pictures of leprechauns. If you ever had a box of Lucky Charms cereal, there's a leprechaun on the front.
Yeah. Where did that come from?
I mean, there's people who believe in leprechauns. In fact, when we were in Iceland a few years ago, there were places where the road we were driving made this kind of a loop and came back around. And the van driver told us that some people still believe in elves in Iceland. And to be respectful, they don't want the road to go over the place where the elves lived. And so I don't know if anybody in Iceland really believes in elves anymore. Maybe there were some old people that do. But look at how their behavior is still built around this idea, this possibility. I don't know. We should have stopped the van and went to look, But so I cannot disprove leprechauns to you. But I think the fact that there's such a lack of evidence, in fact, even a lack of a coherent definition, and then also the fact that there do exist many natural, plausible explanations for how that story arose, right? We can explain that story in natural terms through human myth making and human origins and through human creativity, and through mistakes, let's say, whatever. So when you put all those together, the likelihood of leprechauns existing is really, really low. It's so low that in informal speech, we can round it off and say, no, there's no leprechauns. But in formal speech, if you're going to speak formally to me, I'm going to have to say, well, what I mean is I'm rounding it off. And I think most scientific conclusions are that way. Most scientists get to a 98% confidence or 99%, and then they say, okay, we're going with this. Might be wrong. We might be wrong, but this has been so confirmed. Quantum mechanics is not 100% confirmed, but it is so close. I mean, it's like, I think somebody said it was the distance of the width of a hair between Los Angeles and New York. I mean, it is so close that the likelihood that it would be overturned is so low that we're going to go with it. So a lot of us atheists will say, the likelihood of the existence of God is so low. I'm rounding it off, and I'm going to say, informally, I'm going to say, no, there's no God. There's no leprechauns. There's no God. Prove me wrong. That would be great. I would love to know that I was wrong. But right now, most atheists talk kind of like that. Yeah, it's the likelihood is so bad and so low that, and there's other explanations for how the Bible came into being, and there's other explanations for why people believe, and so on, that we're going to go, we are atheistic. We are not with that belief anymore.
Right. And you explain science quite beautifully, and it seems that science is quite reasonable. All hypotheses are on the table. Science will examine them, and they will be sorted into likely and unlikely, and does not get offended. Science by propositions of some sort. They'll just examine them impartially and find out whether the data and the outside reality support that particular hypothesis. It's very simple, and it cannot. And that's apparently I've had a very a definition of science that it doesn't really confirm anything. It excludes falsities, things that are not. That's what science does most of the time. And it's an elimination process, but we remain open. I mean, if there is an overwhelming evidence that comes over tomorrow, and then there is, I might be swayed. I might be, or at least have a look at the evidence and start to sort of respect it and pay attention. But we don't have that, because we're always accused of that. We close the door. We don't want to listen to anything, no matter what. But it just, as you mentioned before, it's mostly anecdotal evidence. How can you believe somebody else's story? I mean, it's not that because you disbelieve them or you think they're liars. It's just you cannot be them in that. You have no idea how would you react if you were exposed to the same circumstances.
Yeah, some of us, like you, we have a questioning mindset. You know what I mean? We have skeptic. Skeptic doesn't mean negative. Skeptical is open. And so I would say, and I think you would also say, oh, there is a God. Wow. So I was wrong. Wow, that's amazing. I'm glad I learned that. Nice to meet you, God. By the way, where did you come from? We would still have that questioning mind. You know what I mean? Even if there was a God, well, hey, why did you go to such trouble to hide yourself from us? All these, I mean, we would still want to be knowing these questions. And so, and God better have a good answer. That's all I can say.
For a lot of things, yeah. I mean, I think Bertrand Russell and lots of people were asked that question, and they're all imagining what they will be saying to that God. But it would be amazing. I mean, come on. I mean, it would be amazing if there is a creator, maybe not the one conflicted with all this horrible stories in the Bible, and maybe there is somebody who's we're yet to know, and I'm open to that, and it would be wonderful. But I'll be very curious. I'll be wanting. It's actually a scientific thing. I would like to know all the magical recipes where he tampered with all the knobs and created this existence. I'll be quite curious to know more. It'll be wonderful. But going back to the use and that particular argument that's been used a lot, looking at especially the math is quite impressive. They look at the constants of the universe and the ratio of them, and they go, these are so precise. And it's not just one or two. There are few of them conspiring together to create that particular universe that you can exist in. And they go with the chances. We talked about the chances and how it can emerge. But it's still for the non-specialist in that particular realm. It will sounds like something that is out of this world. It's just the coincidence could not be happening here at this point. It's just too precise.
Well, look at the words that you used. You used the word conspiring, and what's happening here is that a lot of people who use the design argument are overlaying, by analogy, human actions. How would a human do this? And so when you think about the fine tuning of the initial constants in our universe, and when you say, well, they're conspiring so that we can live, it's totally backwards. They're not conspiring. They just happen to be what they are. And we just happen to be that one lucky prisoner who didn't get shot. We just happen to be the one. And so the design argument is sort of injecting or infusing into nature this human analogy of us having a purpose behind it all. And so therefore, if it looks like it has a purpose, there must be some mind or purpose behind it all. And so that's where God comes from.
Have you examined at all some of the claims in the Quran of miracles and scientific proof that the God is actually indeed the creator of the universe, and it's the God of the Quran? Some of the things that they have foretold before science find out. Were you at all sort of privy to these sort of arguments?
Yeah, well, I've heard them. They came up in debates.
Yeah.
Apparently, there was some battle and victory that was foretold before it happened.
Yeah, between the Romans and the Persians. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so, but of course, the question was, when was that written?
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
And you can raise that with like the prophecies of Daniel and the Jewish scriptures. Daniel prophesied the future, but of course, the book of Daniel, it turns out, was written after those events actually happened. But a lot of believers think Daniel was written way back, centuries earlier. Yeah. So that is one good question. The one miracle, quote unquote miracle, that was raised in a debate I did with a Muslim in Minneapolis was the Quran itself. The Quran is perfectly written. Nobody has ever been able to imitate the writing style of the Quran. It is unique. The Arabic back then, people can try to write in the style of Shakespeare. People can write in the style of Edgar Allan Poe or Emily Dickinson, but nobody can write in the style of the Quran. And I challenged the guy and I said, well, it's just words. Arabic is just a language, right? And it's put together. And he said, no, but it's perfect. It's, And I said, well, then how do you say there's no God but Allah? How do you say that in, what's that first? There's no God but Allah.
God is great. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, couldn't you, instead of Allah, couldn't you substitute some other God's name like Ixtaxiwadl? Now say that in Arabic. There is no God but Ixtaxiwadl. Yeah. So there you are. You're now speaking in the style of the Quran, right? I mean, so what's this big deal? I mean, and I guess Muslims think it's such this beautiful, big, amazing thing to them. But yeah, and you see,
then how can it be a universal message if it's written? Actually, I got to tell you this secret. Most of these Arabic-speaking modern people will need a dictionary to read the Quran properly. They would not understand half of it because it's written in a very ancient Arabic, and the words are no longer used in the same way. So how is that for a miracle?
And most Muslims don't even speak Arabic in the world.
Oh yeah, Pakistan and Indonesia.
Yeah, like think about that. They don't even know Arabic. So it's kind of like American Catholics reading the Latin Vulgates. I mean, nobody reads that anymore. How do you know it? And yet it seems like when you hear the Latin phrases, it seems so holy. It seems so like majestic, ecclesiastical or something when you hear those phrases. It's just words in a language, in some language from back then.
What makes Quran powerful is the recitation of it. You probably heard the singing of the Quran. You get people who are very like Mary J. Blige sort of people, with fantastic voices singing. And, some people have that particular talent that you just give them the phone book to sing and they will sound wonderful. They just, and there's nothing about the words, just the voice that we connect with. And it's a trick.
And a lot of preachers are like that. The very powerful, wonderful Martin Luther King Jr., his speeches, the way he delivered them with that voice. If you and I were to read the same speeches, it wouldn't have the same power behind it because we don't have his voice. I mean, his voice really went a long way towards motivating and I have a dream. I'm not even going to pretend to imitate the way he could speak. He had that pulpit preacher voice that was just really mesmerizing. Yeah. And so there's a lot of preachers like that, and a lot of imams probably who they're saying things that aren't that important, but they're saying them in this great way that, wow, there must be some meaning here.
Yeah, and add to that, obviously, if they truly believe in what they're saying. So if they're
Yeah.
talented speakers, they truly believe in what they're saying. Of course, it will come out inspiring and wonderful. And you can do that in even in business. You know, if you have a CEO who's really believes his message to the world and his business motto and delivers that with a bit of charisma, I'm sure all the staff and employee will buy into that. And and we had Steve Jobs and other
Yeah.
charismatic CEOs and leaders have done exactly that. So this is nothing new. We know humans have that ability in different ranges of life. Um, so let's just progress. I mean, there was a question here that caught my eye. There is a gentleman who I believe is trying to challenge our premises a bit, and he asked a question. It's actually to you, Dan. He says, "Do you know of anything intelligent being formed by something unintelligent?"
Well, ourselves. If you look at natural selection, if you look at the process of evolution over time, you can see that simple organisms have brains. Even a sea slug at the bottom of the ocean has a very, very simple brain, which has some analogy to our own human nervous system. In fact, we can even look at the fruit fly, the little tiny fruit flies. I don't think you would call them intelligent, but they are working. Their brains are working, and and we can work back to simpler and simpler cells. Look at a virus. Is a virus intelligent? I think most of us would say no. It doesn't have brain cells that are functioning in an organized way, and yet it is right now across the planet. The virus is propagating itself. They get more and more complex to bacteria who are replicating and moving to get to a place where the cells get complicated enough where they would communicate. So you can explain all of intelligence, biological intelligence, through a process leading from simple, non-intelligent things up into more, perhaps half, you might say half intelligent. Is the chipmunk in my backyard intelligent?
Yeah.
Yeah, but can it do math? Can it talk about the teleological argument? No. So it's a different level, right? So there's different levels of intelligence. And even among our own species, you have some pretty stupid people and some pretty smart people. So yes, to answer the question, we can see how intelligence does arise from non-intelligence. Of course, it's kind of a misnomer to call everything non-intelligent. We're overlaying our idea of intelligence upon the world as if the world could be divided into two groups. There's the stuff that's intelligent and there's stuff that's not. I mean, that's a human imposition upon nature. So, and then define what you mean by intelligence, even define that. So
yeah, well, he's persisting with the question, but I think you've explained it. He's saying he reckons that we still have not explained it, but even viruses. I mean, we're talking about viruses. They're actually not classified as living organism. A virus is not a living organism because it does not display all the vital functions of a living organism. So it's actually literally it's undead. It's almost the undead. It's not because the reproduction, the way it does its reproduction, it is not classified as a living thing. So it's always that ethereal question from inanimate to animate things that has got life, and you got that biblical thing, the breath of God, the spirit, the breath, and I think the word Yahweh, I think it's something to do with breathing as well. It seems to be the spirit of God, and it's what makes something a living thing and not a living thing, and it seems to be that breath of God or the spirit.
well, that's like a philosophical word.
Yeah.
Viruses replicate by scavenging cells. They scavenge the material from other cells. Well, we do the same thing when we eat. We are scavenging the cells of other things that are alive. And when we replicate, when humans have sex and the DNA molecule then recombines from the parents and the grandparents, it's scavenging from material that's out around and is putting it together to create a new strand and a new creature that from that random replication. So we're doing the same thing at a different level, of course, but it's the intelligence that comes from a baby that's born from that initial replication is in quality not that much different from what viruses are doing. They're going out and they're grabbing and they're making copies of themselves and going on. Although in quality, in quantity, of course, we have many more cells, and those brain cells that we have in our minds can function at a much higher level than a virus can function. And then we call that intelligence. And that creates this illusion of a person and of a self, and of, if you want to borrow the word, even of a spirit or a soul or something, which really isn't there. It's not even there at all. It's a higher kind of a emergent property of something. So, so yes, we can explain the evolution of intelligence from non-intelligent matter.
Yeah, I mean, I played a few days ago, because there was a continuous rebuttals about this particular area, and the conflation between evolution and biogenesis. And there are theories right now, or people trying to push the idea, the irreducible complexity, that the cell 4 billion years is not enough for the first cell to emerge into this particular complexity. And the famous documentary by, I think, Ben Stein, Expelled, if you recall.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, he had an interview with that, and I am pretty sure, and I've told the guys, we don't know what happened in that interview. The things could be out of context. There could be a question, and the answer to that was not actually displayed and cut and pasted into. But there's a bit where Richard Dawkins has said, well, if you have a problem with the age of the cell and you don't think 4 billion years is enough, we think it is enough from simplicity to complexity to emerge, because we're talking about exponential sort of ratio. I can posit quite easily. We know that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. The universe is about 13.8. So the rest of the universe is about 9 billion years older than the Earth. It's not unconceivable or inconceivable that there is a civilization that was somewhere else in the universe, and that civilization sort of, through the debris or the comets of some of the life forms that have already developed there billions of years ago have reached Earth. But you will still have to explain that particular life organism through evolutionary processes. They haven't just emerged. They've just exactly what happened, but give it some more time, if time is of the essence for you. But then they came and saw, hey, Richard Dawkins talking about aliens being the origin of life, obviously completely misunderstanding his argument.
Yeah. Well, and Dawkins even says that they misled him. He went into that interview thinking it was a pro-science thing, not knowing that it was going to turn into a hatchet job. That's happened to me a couple of times. I was on the Daily Show once. I thought I was going to be there to be interviewed about, and I was, but they turned it into a comedy sketch, which was funny, but it was disappointing. Their purpose was not my purpose. So yeah. Dawkins admits that the whole idea of aliens is just grasping at a hypothesis that might or might not. And yet they took that one little hypothesis and blew it up like, see, Dawkins thinks we came from aliens. So that was obviously a dishonest thing that Ben Stein did.
And what they're missing is aliens, extraterrestrial. That's nothing supernatural about that. These are other organisms that sort of evolved in areas where they can evolve in. There's nothing supernatural about that either. It's not like a God hypothesis.
But I think what they were trying to do in that movie was show that even Richard Dawkins is reduced to grasping at straws in order to explain something which is so hard to explain. See, he has to come up with something like aliens. That shows how bankrupt the theory of evolution is.
Yeah, well, it seems that the Maverick is still not convinced, and he still thinks we have the answer to the original, the how life emerged. And I think you and I, Dan, we sort of talked about this. We said we don't know yet. We don't know yet. The abiogenesis is a quite recent science. We've got some ideas of what will constitute life. We need water, maybe a bit of muddy environments. We need some certain ingredients for life to emerge, but we don't know yet. And we're not ashamed to say we don't know. We don't have the answer to that, but we will not jump into conclusions. That's the only difference.
Well, yeah, but when you think about it, it's true. A God is a hypothesis that could explain life arising from non-life, as if there was some kind of a spark. It depends what this person is defining life. What do you mean by life? And the question, is a virus alive? Is a bacteria alive? Yeah, a bacteria has a cell encasing and all that. But think about your own body. There's nothing in your body that is not natural. Every single cell, every single molecule, every single atom in your body is from outside of your body that was ingested and rearranged to put together to form your body. Everything, every brain cell in your body, the electrochemical synapses between the neurons, all of that is basically physical stuff, and it's functioning as a physical thing. When you turn on your computer, there's times when you're interacting with your computer and you almost get mad at your computer and you yell at it sometimes, and you're interacting with it as if it were some kind of an intelligence, because it was designed to be like an intelligence. But when you turn your computer off, where does the intelligence go? Where is it? Hovering around above the computer somewhere, waiting for you to turn it back on again? Is there some kind of a life force in the computer? We don't think of it that way. We think of it, it's the particular arrangement and the functioning of those bits and bytes, the functioning of them and the arranging of them, that causes what the illusion of what we think is intelligence. Same thing in the human brain. There's nothing in the human brain. Once it's dead, once you turn off the computer, once this brain is dead, it's not functioning anymore. So there's nothing there. It's the functioning of it that we call life. It's the functioning of the organism that we put a name on, and we call that life. There's no such thing as life, like out in the universe, as this thing up there that either exists or doesn't. It's just a way that we describe the functioning of a biological organism, or some of us might describe the functioning of a mechanical thing like a computer. Some people might say computers are alive in a sense because we are interacting with them in some way. So before answering that question in full, I guess we would need a full definition of what it means to be alive.
Yeah. I'm just going to compare notes with you in terms of Christian theology and Muslim theology here. Do you think, and it depends on the different sects, that the soul, according to the Christianity, is eternal?
No, I don't even think there is such a thing as a soul. I think that's just a word that we use to describe, let's say, personality, or a functioning brain, right? Or even a functioning body, we could even say. When people dance, their whole body is part of their self. But so how can it be eternal? It's, when it stops functioning, it stops functioning. And if life by definition is functioning, the organism that's functioning, it'd be like saying, okay, the brain's not the only organism in the body. We have other organs. The stomach is an organ, right? And what does the stomach do? The stomach does digestion. But is digestion a thing? When the stomach dies, is there this capital D digestion that's floating in the universe somewhere? That, what happened to the digestion when the stomach died? Well, I think we can say, although the brain's a lot different from, it's still an organ in a body. I think we can say the same thing. What happens to thought? What happens to personality when the brain stops? Is it floating out there somewhere? Well, that's a dumb question. And in fact, it's so dumb, you can just prove it to yourself by walking across the room. When you walk across the room, is your soul tethered to this cranium? Is it somehow stuck and following it as you walk across from one side of the room to the other? Is there some physical connection making it happen? Or is it really just all contained within your cranium and defined in terms that make it look to us like it's an emergent property, like a soul or a spirit or something that lives beyond the body, when it's not? It's just the organ functioning.
Yeah, and I completely agree with this. Sorry, I didn't make myself very clear. I was speaking in the context of from the point of view of a believer, of a Christian believer. Christian believers believe in the eternity of the soul, right?
Most of them do. Yeah, there probably are some who don't, but I think most of them do.
So, which means, I mean, is it been created at birth, or before you were born? Dan, and obviously you die, your soul sort of goes to either heaven or hell or limbo if you're a child. But what happened to your soul or your non-physical existence, since it's eternal, before your terrestrial birth? There must be, that soul must have pre-existed somewhere. I mean, I guess what is happening here? What's the deal with that?
So, well, maybe it was asleep all that time. So Hindu theologies sort of touch on that, and that we did pre-exist, that we are a reincarnation of an earlier existence, that existence was eternal. And I think most Christians would say that the soul is eternal moving forward from here. God creates you at birth. God creates your soul. You did not exist before, unlike Christ, who did exist eternally with the Father, they say. Yeah. So once at conception, in fact, a lot of people think it's right at conception where God then somehow, with maybe a big syringe or something, he comes in. There you go. Now Dan Barker was created at that point, and from then on, it's eternal. That's kind of how I thought of it.
Yeah. Okay. So it's like co-eternal. So it's like the Christ thing. It's which is basically the Logos thing. That's how they get around it, because they say, well, there was no mention of that Jesus in the Old Testament. And then they get around the Logos and the Word of God, and it's actually used in the Quran as well, that the Word of God could have been that of Jesus. It's a very interesting concept, but I mean, we're obviously, we've got some of your the people that might follow some of your work, and they're basically saying that looks like both of us have a belief or a faith. So maybe atheism is a kind of religion, just like not collecting stamps is a hobby.
Well, if they want to call it that, they can, but it doesn't mean anything. I mean, if atheism is a religion, and it's not, but if it were, all you're saying is that, well, you've dragged us down to the same level you're at, basically. I mean, you can define terms any way you want, but you're right. It's, there's that old joke. If atheism is a religion, then baldness is a hair color, right? The way I like to explain it in debates is, let's say you got a TV at your house, and you've got a list of channels, of TV channels. Oh, there's TBS, there's CNN, there's MSNBC, and what are there, like maybe 500 channels? I don't know, but you have this big long list of channels of shows you can watch. Well, think of it like religions. Oh, there's a Catholic, there's a Muslim, there's a Seventh-day Adventist, there's a Hindu. You got a big list of religions on here that you could pick from, of all these TV channels. Oh, I'm going to pick this one. Oh, I'm going to, Christian Missionary Alliance, or there's Buddhists, and there's Mormons on here. Mormon is channel 117. And so where's atheism on that list? Atheism is not on that channel list. Atheism is the off button. You just turn off the TV. It's none of the above. It's just not even on that list at all. And yet a lot of believers think atheism is like it's part of the smorgasbord. Oh, I can pick this or this. Oh, there's atheism. It's in there too. But it's not. Atheism is just none of that. Instead of looking at the world through the TV screen, the atheists turn it off and they go outside and look at the real world. Mm-hmm. Look at nature. Look at the real world that we live in without having to go through some religious screen, through some religious framework about how the world works. Because which one are you going to pick? The one that you feel best with? Most likely you pick the one that you were raised in. In fact, the single biggest predictor of a person's religion, if you didn't know anything about them, it's geography. If I know that you were born and raised in Baghdad, my bet is, and what would your bet be about their religion?
Shia Muslim, maybe?
Yeah, there you go. If you knew that I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, what would you pick?
Evangelical.
You know what I mean? Yeah, or Southern Baptist or whatever. So really, we are really kind of products of our geography and our heritage. Some people jump outside of that, of course. Some people change religions, but in generally, the biggest predictor, if you had to pick one thing, it would be where the person was from. And that tells you a lot, doesn't it? All the religious people who are watching the show, look at your own heritage, your own history, look at your own. Some of you, maybe, a few of you maybe reasoned to your faith using the apologetic arguments, but I doubt most believers do. Most Muslims didn't pick Islam. They were born into it. It's just part of what they know is true because that's who they are as people.
Yeah. Well, the Maverick is asking a question I think that's been answered by science long ago. He's invoking the first cause or the prime mover, which is, I guess, started by Aristotle. Basically, he notices that the order of things is everything is moving. And for things to move, you observe real life, things are static in front of you, and you got to move the ball for the ball to move. And he sort of deposits that at that point, and there must be something that keeps the planets at orbit and things moving. So there's got to be that first mover. But we know now, based on Newtonian physics and Einstein and refined physics, that's not true at all. Actually, the nature of things is moving, and the things like gravity and other obstacles will actually stop it from moving forever and at a certain speed as well. So it looks like it was the other way around. So I'm not sure why they're still invoking science that is sort of four centuries BC.
Yeah, and that falls under the cosmological arguments, the prime mover, the cause of it all. And as you point out, of course, especially under Einstein, we all know that movement is relative. If you and I were floating out in space somewhere having this interview, and we could sort of reach out and shake hands and talk to each other. Imagine that we're out in space and you're there and you're not moving. You're just staying right there in front of me. And so am I. How do we know that we are or are not moving through space? How do you know that? We don't know that we're not moving. Relative to what? Relative to, right now, relative to the sun, we're going around about 1 year per year, right? We're going around the sun. Relative to some object, we are moving. Although it looks like relative to each other, we're not. But relative to the center of the galaxy, we're moving at, how long does it take to go around? How many billions of years does it take? Anyway, so we have to find a point that you say relative to that point, we are moving, but relative to some other point, we are not moving. So movement becomes kind of an incoherent. To talk about a prime mover assumes that there is some fixed frame of reference in which something is always completely still. And then here comes a force like a billiard ball, bang, and now it's moving. But relative to what? To this supposed fixed frame of reference? There is no such thing. Everything is relative.
Yeah, well, it seems that way from my understanding of science as well, that these sort of arguments that sort of suggest that there must be a prime mover or first cause, even causation itself. I mean, we did talk about this God who apparently is outside of space and time, but his own actions require time because they are consequential. They seem to be 3 or 4 parts of that particular act, and they cannot all happen at the same time. So it seems to be that he's subject to time itself. Otherwise, he would have had a different type of having his will manifesting in existence. The water analogy, where his spirit was already floating on over the water, and it did not create the water. It was the water then coexistent, just like the Nicene Creed, where they debated whether Christ was coexistent with God or emerged from God. This seems to be whole, but they seem to be a persistence in the chat, thinking that we are saying we know how life came about. And I have to keep saying we don't know, and that's fine. We're fine with that. That's what science does, and we're not going to be impatient about it and jump onto conclusions. We're going to wait until the results come in, like they've done over centuries before.
Yeah, and the whole idea of causality itself, cause and effect, requires time.
Yeah.
Causality is a temporal thing. One of the main ways we know that B did not cause A is because B happened after A. You wouldn't say that B caused A if B happened after A. And so, of course, you could have synchronicity. You could have two events happening at the exact same time, I suppose. So if you're going to use the cosmological argument, you're going to have to require temporality. And even if you look at the holy writings, the Bible and the Quran, this God is described in temporal terms, using words that are temporal words. God created, God did, God acted, as if there were a before that time and an after that time, and some kind of a sequence of events in time leading up to that action of this deity. So you can't talk about causality without talking about time. But as you point out, some apologists try to sneak around that problem by saying, well, God exists outside of time. Aha. So therefore, he's not subject to the objections of cause and effect that the rest of us are. But what does that even mean? What does outside of time even mean? You can't be outside of time. Time's a dimension. Can you be outside of height? Can you be outside of width? You know what I mean? It's not a thing. Time's not a thing that you would be outside of. It's just a dimension in our brains that however you want to define it. Most people right now define time as connected to entropy. As the only way we know that there's such a thing as, or think there's such a thing as time, is because things are moving. And entropy, and we start our lives, start as babies, and we get older and we decay, and so on. Other people think of it in terms of increasing order rather than increasing disorder. But you can't avoid time. You can't have a creature. You cannot have a being, especially a creature or a being who has a functional mind that's making decisions. You can't have that outside of time. That's incoherent. That's just the same thing as saying it doesn't exist.
Yeah. There is also a bit of conflation then. Causation doesn't necessarily mean an intelligent agency. So you can say, my garage was destroyed last night. Whoa, what happened? Oh, it was a storm last night. The storm caused my garage to be destroyed. Does the storm have intention or will or wanted to do that in revenge because you wanted to nuke the hurricane like your president once wanted to do? Obviously not. But because we invoke agencies. We talked about it in our evolutionary background, that we always detect agency in faces because that's how we survived. So for anything to happen, we always predicted there's got to be some intent behind it. But what if it wasn't? What if it's just one thing causing another thing to happen? There are things, consequential things with no intention, happen at random, and in a certain combination, it creates a certain meaningful form, be it the snowflake or the universe. It's the same thing. But to go one step further and say, oh, and by the way, that thing that caused that thing is an all-powerful, all-merciful, perfect being that wants you to love him, and he loves you back. And in case you don't love him back, he's prepared hell for you. And that entity, it cannot be falsified. It's just there. You got to believe first, and then he will emerge in your life. How am I going to accept that? I mean, it's very difficult to understand. Why is intent always pushed into the scenario?
Yeah, like we see the man on the moon. We see a face. Although in India, I think they see a rabbit in the moon. I don't think they see I think it's that way in Hindu religion. In my country, my garage could never be destroyed by a storm, but my garage could be. That's the way we say it over here.
More French tone to garage.
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know why we say garage instead of garage, but so you learned English through the British learning, right?
Yes. Well, I lived in Ireland for quite some time. You probably hear a bit of an Irish twang here and there.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds like a leprechaun. Yeah.
To be sure.
Yeah, maybe. So that made me think, when you're talking about a storm, sometimes believers say, well, look at the information that's in a DNA molecule. Look at that. It's information, it's intelligence is being passed on from generation to generation. And there's a difference between intelligent, intentional communication and just plain old information. If a storm blows through and destroys your garage, the meteorologists can produce a printout of that storm from when it started to when it ended. And there would be all these times and wind speeds and air pressure and barometric pressure. And there could be an accounting of the damage, and there could be so on. You could, at the end of the storm, you would have this huge list of information. And you could say, look at all this information that we got from this storm. That doesn't mean that's intelligent, intentional information. That just means we're describing what happened. And I think the same thing is true with the DNA molecule. There's a lot of information that's being passed down, but it's not like somebody is trying to communicate with us something. The information is a non-intelligent passing down of the actual data and the actual facts as time passes, either as the storm passes or as the generations pass through time.
Yeah. Well, when I spoke to Lawrence Krauss last, I think he says something really funny and quite meaningful about the why question. We always end up with the why question, but he always says, well, whenever we say why, we actually means how or what. Persisting with the question why, it's almost you end up being like a child, and your parents are eventually going to say, because go to bed.
Yeah.
There's no answer to that. There's just no answer. But I do love, I've got it here on screen. The Maverick has had a very good, interesting analysis of the God that he believes in. He says, God equals impersonal, like universal laws, timeless, like photons, eternal, like energy, formless, like EM waves, divine consciousness. It's wonderful. It sounds very poetic, but I am not sure how can we verify that. How can we falsify that or verify that?
Well, I think we can embrace all of that. The laws, the photons, the energy, the waves, and so on. I think we can all embrace all of that. We just don't need to stick the word God on it. It's just, a tree is a tree. I could look at that tree out my window and say, well, is that God? Well, if you want to call it God, that's your prerogative, I guess. But that's a tree. A tree is a tree. And so the laws of nature are the laws of nature, and the functioning of intelligence in these synapses between the neurons that give this emergent illusion of intelligence, that's what that is. If you can describe it in purely natural terms, then you don't need a supernatural word to overlay it. You can just accept the natural definition for what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm having an episode tomorrow about Stephen Hawking. I'm going to talk about him in Arabic to the Arabic audience, and unfortunately, him and Einstein in that dilemma of our poor linguistic skills. We're so much affected by our theistic past that we have to invoke the word God to mean something great or big. So in the brief history of time, Hawking talked about, so we can understand the mind of God, and Einstein's misunderstood most famous quote that God does not play dice, and understood now by the Muslim world out of context. They've got him a quotation that he was a believer after all. But this seems to be, obviously we know that Einstein was a pantheist at best, and Spinoza probably was the God of Spinoza was closer to be his God, which is basically not a God, not a personal God. It's physics. It's the elegance of physics, and you're right. It's names. We call these things different names. But what are the implications? There are no implications for to believe that these energies are beautiful and we can understand them, we can learn about them. But if that energy starts telling you to kill your own son, or pray 5 times a day towards Mecca, or cut the foreskin of your penis, then we're gonna say, oh, hold on a second. What's going on here? So this is the area of, I guess, of where we part ways. We can all embrace the beauty of nature and science and understand the world around us, But once start talking back to us and asking us to do certain things, especially to other people, then it becomes a little bit, how do you know that this becomes important?
Well, to say that when Einstein said God doesn't play dice with the universe, he was obviously speaking metaphorically. It would be like you saying that leprechauns do not dance the tango. Leprechauns dance the Irish jig, right? We all know that, right? Because so when you say that, you're making a point, not that there really are leprechauns, but you're trying to make some point using this mythical thing. And by the way, Stephen Hawking, in his next book, after he wrote Brief History of Time, he admitted that phrase, the mind of God, was problematic. In fact, it was not in his original manuscript that he sent the publisher. And the British version of his book did not have that phrase, but the American publishers told him, you need to keep this in here because you'll sell more books if you have it in there. And he objected. He says, he explained in a later book that he did not want that phrase in the book because it was so ambiguous. But the American publisher insisted, no, let's keep that in there because it'll be more palatable to people. And so even then, he's saying it was more of a marketing reason why that phrase was put there, not because it reflected that he actually believed in a God. He was embarrassed about that phrase being in the book.
Yeah. I mean, we know for sure he explicitly told he was an atheist, didn't believe in that sort of thing. Not he spent so much time on it. He was busy solving other problems and coming up with all clever ideas. Dan, we've reached obviously 90 minutes, and I understand that you might have some other arrangements. Would you like to conclude with some final thoughts about this entire false dilemma?
Well, I guess the teleological arguments, I think, like many of the apologetic arguments for God, they have things backwards. It's like looking through the wrong end of the telescope. You're going to see something, but you're using it the wrong way. We're looking at the world through the human telescope, through human analogies. We're trying to project our way in thinking on nature itself. So a lot of these arguments are basically just humanizing, if you want to say, or deifying the universe by projecting ourselves onto all of that. And here's a very simplistic way to deal with most of those arguments. It's not necessarily the best way. And if you're limited for time, probably the most simplistic thing you can do to sort of show the illogic of these arguments is just turn them around. So if everything needs a designer, then doesn't God need a designer? Right? You could turn it to God himself. Every argument you use, if there's a first cause of everything, a prime mover, then what about God? Wasn't there a first cause or a prime mover to God? Take these, and I know this is simplistic, but if you just ask the question that my 5-year-old daughter asked once, we were out having lunch one day, and she said, "Daddy, if God made everything, who made God?" And I said to her, "That's a good question. Even a 5-year-old can think. You don't need to be trained in apologetics or science or philosophy. You can just kind of think about the world that we live in and ask the same questions that you would ask about the world, ask them about this God itself." And that goes a long way towards showing the illogicality. Is that the word? Illogical. The illogic of a lot of these supposed apologetic arguments.
Yeah, and you can turn it around another 90 degrees to say, well, if God can display these properties to claim that throne of being the first cause, the cosmos itself can be that candidate.
Yeah, and if God is eternal, then the cosmos can be eternal.
Yeah. And does not need a supernatural understanding, because it's a thing. It does not have intent. It's a thing that it's always been there. Because the more we look at nothing, it seems to be that there is no such thing as nothing. It's always been something. Even what we understand to be nothing, and that's a conversation I'm going to have with Lawrence Krauss, is not. The philosophical nothing is not the physical nothing. There seems to be never nothing at any point. There's always been something. Even the void of everything carries crazy amount of quantum fluctuations in energy. So it's the question, has there ever been nothing?
Well, even the word nothing means no thing. You have to
Yeah.
have a thing first that you don't have. So that even the concept of nothing doesn't make any sense unless you have something.
Correct.
So it's an incoherent nothingness.
Fantastic.
Is an incoherent concept.
I love that, because you're right. Absolutely, thinking about it, it's a negation of something that must have existed before. For nothing to exist, something therefore must exist to negate that existence. But if nothing was the origin of things, then there would be no word for it. It would be the void. That would be the nothing. It'll be like there will be like no word to explain it. It's the void.
And the only way to conceive of that would be to not conceive of anything. It would be to be dead, basically. Then, if you were dead, then you would conceive of nothingness.
Yeah, or obviously our memory of us before birth, which is non-existent unless you believe in reincarnation. And Christopher Hitchens, will probably end with this light note, always talked about how funny it is when people believe in reincarnation and they've always existed, but they've always existed as princes and kings, and nobody is a bum or used to be a beggar on the street. They're all
because 99% of our history was subsistence living, and yet everybody used to be some Prince of Wales or something.
Fantastic, Dan. Look, I always enjoy the conversation. I always enjoy that I'm in front of a camera and I'm talking to a wise being in the other side of the world. So I really thank you so much for all these pearls of wisdom.
Well, thank you. You're a pretty smart guy there. So you're doing a great job with your show.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody. Tomorrow I'll be talking about Stephen Hawking. See you tomorrow.